Lord be with you.
And also with you.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to John.
Glory to you, Lord.
Jesus appeared again to the disciples beside the Sea of Galilee. This is how it happened. Several of the disciples were there. Simon Peter, Thomas, called the twin, Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and 2 other disciples. Simon Peter said, "I am going fishing." "We will come too," they all said. So they went out in the boat, but they caught nothing all night. At dawn, Jesus was standing on the beach, but the disciples could not see who he was. He called out, "Fellows, have you caught any fish?" "No," they replied. Then he said, "Throw out your net on the right-hand side of the boat, and you will get some." So they did, and they couldn't haul in the net because there were so many fish in it. Then the disciple Jesus loved said to Peter, "It is the Lord." When Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on his tunic, for he had stripped for work, jumped into the water, and headed to shore. The others stayed with the boat and pulled the loaded net to the shore, for they were only about 100 yards from the shore. When they got there, they found breakfast waiting for them, fish cooking over a charcoal fire and some bread. "Bring some of the fish you've just caught," Jesus said. So Simon Peter went aboard and dragged the net to the shore. There were 153 large fish, and yet the net had not torn. "Now come and have some breakfast," Jesus said. None of the disciples dared to ask him, "Who are you?" They knew it was the Lord. Then Jesus served them the bread and the fish. This was the 3rd time Jesus had appeared to his disciples since he had been raised from the dead. After breakfast, Jesus asked Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord," Peter replied. "You know I love you." "Then feed my lambs," Jesus told him. Jesus repeated the question, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" "Yes, Lord," Peter said. "You know I love you." "Then take care of my sheep," Jesus said. A 3rd time he asked him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was hurt that Jesus asked the question a 3rd time. He said, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you." Jesus said, "Then feed my sheep. I tell you the truth. When you were young, you were able to do as you liked. You dressed yourself and went wherever you wanted to go. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and others will dress you and take you where you don't want to go." Jesus said this to let him know by what kind of death he would glorify God. Then Jesus told him, "Follow me." The word of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ. Hallelujah. On the altar that we have a new server on the altar, and that's Olivia. Stand up, Olivia. I'm so happy she's going to help help us pray on Sundays. Isn't that wonderful?
Yes.
It's great to have you, and may you be a server for many, many years. And who knows, maybe you'll become a priest someday. Could happen. You see that now, Olivia. And also, we are honored to have a distinguished visitor here this morning, a good friend of our community. Bishop Martin de Porres is here with us. Bishop, if you can stand up, and let's give him a warm He called me the other day, said he was going to be in Orange County, and wondered if we had Mass on Sunday morning. And I said, yes. And he said he'd like to come, and I said, I'd like for you to come. And so we're grateful that you have come to be with us. And Bishop Martin exercises his ministry with the American Catholic Church down in San Diego. And occasionally some of the members of that community come up and visit with us. You might have remembered a few weeks ago, there was some people that were here from that community. So God is at work. And there are many communities starting throughout the world that maintain a faithful devotion to the Catholic faith tradition, but at the same time, realize that the Holy Spirit is moving in new ways in our day. And that's why there are communities like St. Matthew's and St. John the Beloved in San Diego and other places across the world. I was contacted by 2 communities in Italy this past week. And it's their desire to affiliate with the ECC, which is the larger organization we belong to. So we start small, but God likes to start big things in small ways. And we can see something unfolding throughout the world, and I can only say that it is the move of the Spirit. There was a day, many months after Jesus was raised from the dead, that a man called Peter was arrested and brought before the high priest and the Sanhedrin. They were unhappy that he was proclaiming the name of Jesus there in the holy city of Jerusalem, and they ordered them to be silent. Peter responds with great courage and fearlessness by saying, "We are to obey God and not man." And all the boldness of Peter that was evidenced in that day as he stood on trial was evidence of a tremendous transformation that took place in his life. But he got it right. It is our moral obligation, it's our highest obligation, my brothers and sisters, to obey God even if it contradicts the word of men. We're not to obey men no matter how exalted they may be in positions of religious authority or power. We are bound, our hearts and consciences, to follow the direction of God. Peter learned this, but he didn't know it right away. It took some time. When Jesus began his Galilean ministry some 3.5 years before this moment in Peter's life, as was recorded for us in the Acts of the Apostles, Jesus began his ministry along the shores of the Sea of Galilee. And it didn't take very long before tens of thousands of people were following and desiring to hear this new preaching, this new teaching from this rabbi from Nazareth. And on one day, Jesus was walking along the shores, the stony beach of the Sea of Galilee. And as he was doing so, the great crowds came and sought him out. And they were desiring to hear him speak. And they were desiring to be healed by him, because it was known that Jesus was not only a great teacher sent from God, but he had the power, the uncanny ability to bring healing to broken lives. And so they gathered by the thousands and they followed after him. And the press of the crowd became so great as he was walking along the shoreline that I think Jesus was afraid they were going to push him into the sea. That's when he noticed 2 fishermen's boats there along the shore, as the fishermen were there cleaning their nets after a long night of work. And it was in the early morning, and Jesus called one of the fishermen, and his name was Simon. And he said, "Simon, I want to get in your boat, and could you push it out a few yards?" And Jesus climbed into the boat, and I guess Simon thought, well, I guess that's what I got to do, you know. Jesus had a certain audacity about him. But there was a power to his personality that struck wonder in the hearts of all who met him. And as he sat down on the deck of the fisherman's boat, he then continued his ministry of teaching to the crowds that were standing along the shore. And he spoke for a very long time, for many hours, and yet they held on to every word that came forth from his mouth. They were transfixed, and they were overwhelmed by the presence and the teaching of this new prophet that was among them. And it makes you grateful that I only preach for 20 minutes, huh? Well, as the morning was wearing on, the time of teaching was coming to a close, and Jesus turns to the fisherman. His name is Simon. And there Simon was with his brother Andrew, and then there were in the other boat, their partners, John and James, the sons of Zebedee. And he says, let us go out into the midst of the lake and let's go fishing, Jesus says. Let's go for a great fish and throw out your nets. And when Simon heard this, he responds to Jesus. And you can imagine what was going through the mind of Simon, the fisherman. Because Simon was an expert in his field. He was a professional when it came to fishing. He knew every inch of that lake. He knew where the shallows were, which was the most desirable place to catch a good load of fish. He knew the best times of day to go. And any fisherman will tell you it's best to go in the wee hours of the morning before sunrise, and that's when you'll get the greatest catch of fish. And so Peter the fisherman looks at this rabbi and carpenter from Nazareth, probably thinking, what do you know about fishing? I'm the professional, I'm the expert, you know nothing about this. We've been fishing all night long, he said to Jesus, and we caught nothing. And now you're asking us to go out into the deepest part of the lake, in the center of the lake, in the middle of the day, which is the worst place and the worst time to expect to find any fish. Peter knew this. He relied on his long years of experience as a fisherman. But Peter, I think, at this moment, or Simon, at this moment, I think, was humoring Jesus. He says, we've been fishing all night long and we caught absolutely nothing. But nevertheless, I'll take you up on this. Yeah, we'll go. At your word, we will go out there and throw the nets out. I'm going to show this rabbi. And then as they went out there and they cast the nets over the side of the boat, they caught so many fish that they couldn't even drag the nets aboard the boat. They had to call over John and James and their fishing boat, and they brought the boat over, and they caught so many fish that both of those fishing boats were about to sink. Now, these fishing boats weren't canoes or rowboats or something you and I would go out and fish in. These were professional boats designed to hold a large cargo of fish. They're designed to be out there in the waters and to do their job. Peter, in all of his days as a fisherman, never saw anything of the sort ever happen. This should not have happened. Experience taught him so. And yet he encountered something that was counter to all of his experience and his intuition about fishing. And he was awestruck, this professional fisherman. What does Peter do? He, at this moment of this great miracle that he recognizes, falls on his face at the feet of Jesus on the deck of his boat, and he says, "Depart from me, Lord, for I'm a sinful man." You know, when we have an encounter with the Lord Jesus, we have a double revelation. Two things are shown about this in this kind of encounter. One, Peter recognized who Jesus, this rabbi, was. He calls him Lord. He saw Jesus for what he really was. And simultaneously to this revelation of who Jesus was and who it was that he was in the presence of, Peter realized the truth about himself. He realized the truth because he became keenly aware and painfully aware of his tremendous inadequacy in the presence of such a holy one as Jesus. And he said, as he was overcome by this miracle, overcome with great fear, he says, "Depart from me, because I'm a sinful man. I'm an unclean man." We see this as a consistent record of those who have an encounter with God. They're overwhelmed with the glory of God and the joy that that brings, but simultaneously they're aware of their brokenness and their sinfulness. This was the case with Peter. How does Jesus respond to Peter, the fisherman, in this moment? Well, I'll tell you one thing. He didn't say, yeah, Peter, you're right, you are a sinful man. Sometimes religious people get the idea that we have to tell people about how deficient they are. Yeah, you're right, you are a sinful man. No, Jesus didn't say that. Jesus says, fear not. Don't be afraid, Peter. Because Jesus, whenever he spoke, the one line that he uses the most, the one statement he would say over and over again before his resurrection, before he was taken to Jerusalem and killed, Jesus would say over and over again the most common words, don't be afraid. Did you know that? The most common word and message to Jesus, to those who would follow him, is don't be afraid. The most common message that Jesus says over and over and that we must hear is fear not, because we're so afraid. Our lives are governed by fear, worry, and anxiety. It drives us. Fear is the opposite of love. Fear is what besets and haunts the human heart. And Jesus speaks this word to Simon. He says, fear not. And then Jesus calls him. He says, from now on, your life has changed. You're going to be a fisher of men. Come, follow me. And from that point on, Peter became the most faithful disciple of Jesus. He was seen with Jesus throughout the next 3 years. Wherever Jesus was, where he was preaching or doing miracles or whatever activity Jesus was engaged to him, you could be sure that you would see Simon Peter standing next to him. And in the Gospels, Simon Peter is depicted as being the most outspoken of all the disciples. And he was always there with Jesus wherever Jesus went. And wherever Jesus was going to go, Peter felt sure he would always be at the side of this great and holy man. This was Peter's conversion. And in fact, his name was Simon. That's how he was known. Simon, son of John. That was his formal name. That's how everybody knew him. But it was Jesus who gave him a nickname. My wife is fond of giving people a nickname. How many have been given a nickname by me? Well, you know. Yeah, you know, when you get a nickname from my wife, you know that you have made it. You know, you can be sure of your salvation if she gives you a nickname. And sometimes they're pretty silly nicknames, but that's the way she is. You know, that's the way she shows her endearment to you. And I won't tell you what she calls me. But Jesus did the same sort of thing. And he looked at Simon and he says, you know what? You shall be known as Kephas. That's the Aramaic, which means rock. Translated into Greek, it's Petros. Translated in English, it's the familiar name Peter. And that was never a personal name until this time. And Jesus gave him that name. It's like calling someone Rocky. So among the 12, there was James and John and all the others. And then there was this man, Rocky, with a new name, Peter. That's who he was. And what a glorious experience it was for this disciple. He witnessed all the great works of Jesus. And then 3 years later, when they went into Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover, they were together in the upper room. 120 people were assembled, and they were celebrating the traditional Seder meal. And as they were there, Jesus, even though it was a lot of festivity and celebration that was going on, because this was a high and holy day, it was a celebration, and they were there in Jerusalem in this upper room. Jesus was very solemn on this occasion. And at this moment, when Jesus was there, he says, one of you will betray me. And that startled the disciples, and they wondered who it would be that would do such a dastardly act as to betray him. And he said, is it I, Lord? Is it I? And then it was in the course of this meal that Peter turned to Jesus and says, I will never leave you. I will never depart from you. I will even die for you. And I think Peter meant it. That's the kind of man he was. That was his intention. And then Jesus turns to him and says, oh, Peter, if you only knew that before the cock crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. And Peter says, no, no, I will go with you to the very end. Not knowing of the dramatic events that would follow. The next scene, they're in the Garden of Gethsemane at the foot of the Mount of Olives, outside the city of Jerusalem. And on that fateful night, a band of soldiers led by the betrayer Judas came. And there were temple guards and there were priests that came and they arrested Jesus. And all the disciples fled in fear from that scene. And Jesus was taken alone, bound with this armed guard to the house of the high priest. Wherever the other disciples went, we do not know, but we know where Peter and John went. They followed behind. Peter was making that attempt to be a faithful disciple of Jesus. And so even though Jesus was bound and helpless and being carried away by an armed guard, Peter followed in the distance behind, thinking of a way he could rescue his master. They led Jesus to the palace or the house of Caiaphas the high priest. They led him into the courtyard and up into the house where there was a great hall. And there the Sanhedrin had assembled, and it was the middle of the night, in the wee hours of the morning. And Peter and John gained entrance into the high priest's home through the gate, and they stood around the fire with the guards and the servants, warming themselves. And as they were there, Peter could see Jesus bound and standing before Caiaphas and Annas and the other members of the Sanhedrin under trial as they tried to find something in which they could accuse Jesus to give them the ability, the excuse to terminate his life, to murder him, because they saw Jesus was a problem and there needs to be a solution to this problem. And it seems the only solution is his death, but we got to find some legal means in which to put him to death. And that was what's going on. And meanwhile, in the outer court, Peter's standing around the fire, warming himself. And a young girl comes to him and says, I recognize you. You're one of his disciples, aren't you? And Peter says, no, I am not one of this man's disciples. Then another servant came up. Surely you are one of his disciples. I think I've seen you with him. In fact, you speak with a Galilean accent. Surely you're one of his disciples. And again, Peter denies it. He says, I am not his disciple. And then the cock crows once. It could be heard in the distance. And then another servant came up and says, surely you were with him. You are a disciple of this Jesus. And Peter is cursing and he's swearing. And he says, I have never known the man. Luke's gospel adds a poignant observation at this moment. As soon as Peter said for the third time, with cursing and swearing, I have not known this man. I do not know him. The cock crowed the second time. Peter turned and he looked at Jesus, just to catch his eye as Jesus turned around and looked at Peter. Peter saw the gaze of Jesus and it broke him. He flees from the garden. He flees from the courtyard out into the dark streets of Jerusalem, and we are told that he wept bitterly. You see, Peter was a broken man. He thought that he had it in him to stand with Jesus, even to die for him. But he ended up not any better than Judas Iscariot. He even denied that he ever knew his friend, Jesus. Jesus was abandoned by Peter on that night, and Peter was a broken man. But I have something to tell you, my brothers and sisters. The story is not over. It didn't end with that. Peter thought it was all over, but the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. Jesus called Peter to be his disciple. And even though Peter failed him in the worst possible way, denying he ever even knew him, still the call was upon Peter's life. You know the story of what happened to Jesus. He's crucified. He dies. He's laid in the tomb, and then he's raised from the dead. And the resurrection appearances of Jesus begin to happen in rapid succession. Out of nowhere, Jesus would appear. This would startle the disciples. And in their bewilderment, they would behold in great joy the presence of Jesus, raised from the dead in their presence. And they didn't know what to make of this. And then as soon as they were getting used to Jesus being around, he would disappear again. And this would happen over and over again. And between those times, the disciples didn't know what to do with themselves. Well, Peter did. Peter thought it was all over for him. He denied his Lord. He was no longer a disciple. It was all washed up for him. And so he says to his companions, I'm going back to fishing. And so he returns to Galilee and he decides, this is my lot in life. I'm to be what I was always intended to be, and that is a fisherman. And so they went out all night. Notice the scene again. It seems similar to the story we heard earlier. This time they're out there in the Sea of Galilee all night long, and they catch absolutely nothing. As morning twilight approaches, they see a lone figure standing on the beach, and they're wondering who that is. And there's a small fire that had been built, and there's fish cooking on the fire. And then the lone figure calls out to the disciples on the boats. They were out many yards from the shore.
Boys, have you caught anything yet?
No. I don't know if they like to admit it, but no. And then Jesus says, why don't you throw your net on the right side of the boat? You see, you knew he wasn't a fisherman because he didn't say on the starboard side or that. On the right side of the boat. Spoken just like a carpenter. They go, okay. They throw the net over, and again, we have a repeat of the miracle that occurred when Jesus first called Peter. Do you see the parallel there? Jesus is recreating a scene from 3 years ago when Jesus first called Peter. And someone said, that must be the Lord. And as soon as Peter heard those words, he dressed himself in his tunic because he was stripped for working as a fisherman, and he swam all the way to the shore. And as he got out of the water, he was so filled with excitement to see his friend Jesus again, raised from the dead. And all of a sudden, the burden of his shame and guilt for what he had done in denying Jesus overtakes him, and he can hardly look at Jesus in the eye. And Jesus gathers his disciples around them as they come to shore, and they gather around the fire, and they eat breakfast. Jesus now is serving them their breakfast. And they're there in silence. They didn't know what to say, especially Peter. So now Jesus takes the initiative. And he talks to Peter because Jesus is going to deal with what's going on in Peter's life. That's the way Jesus is with you and me, my brothers and sisters. He doesn't sweep anything under the rug. He helps us to engage those challenges that we face in life, those failings, those limitations. We have to face them honestly, and Jesus will enable us to do that. And so here's how the conversation unfolds. He addresses a question. He says, Simon, son of John. Notice that Jesus does not call him by his affectionate nickname. He doesn't say Cephas. He uses the formal name, Simon, son of John. I don't know about you, but when your parent or your mother says to you your full name, you know you're in trouble. Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these, than the fishing business? Do you love me more than your fishing business? And your friends, and your family, do you love me more than these? Peter responds, Lord, hardly able to look at him. You know that I love you. Now, this is a very powerful moment. And the English text does convey a great deal of the meaning. But unfortunately, it doesn't convey the detail of meaning that the Greek language in which this is written conveys. When Jesus asked Peter if he loved him, he used a particular Greek word for love. The Greeks have 4 words for love. And he used the word agape. Agape is perfect love. Agape is divine love. Agape is the perfection of charity. It is a love not dependent upon feeling or circumstances. Agape is a choice to be loving even when someone cannot love you in return. And Jesus says to Peter, do you love me with this highest kind of love? And then Peter responds, Lord, you know. And in English, I just lost something, but that's okay. In English, it's just translated love, but he doesn't use the word agape. He uses the word phileo. Phileo is a Greek word that indicates the kind of love that is shared between two friends. It's loving affection. It is having an affinity for someone else. And so what Peter was saying, I love you like a friend. Now, I don't know about you, but years ago when I was dating, and I was attracted to a woman when I was dating, and I was thinking, oh, I hope this turns into something, and then the woman would say to me, yeah, Peter, I like you as a friend. I love you as a friend. I knew it was all over at that point. So here Jesus saying, do you love me with perfect love? And Peter can only muster, I love you like a friend. A moment of silence, and then the second time, then Peter says, I love you like a friend, and Jesus says, tend my lambs. Tend my lambs. Then Jesus addresses him a second time. He says, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Agape. And Simon says to him, Lord, you know that I love you. Phileo. I love you like a friend. Another pause of silence, and they're eating their breakfast. And Jesus asks him for a third time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Jesus uses the word phileo. See how Jesus comes down to our level? He recognizes our inadequacies, but he persists. Simon, do you love me? And the scripture says that Simon was deeply troubled that Jesus would ask him a third time. But Peter, remember, denied him 3 times. Each of those was an incident that needed to be dealt with. And Jesus tenderly confronts Peter with the truth about himself. And now Peter is grieving because he is writhing in his shame. And Jesus says, do you love me like a friend? And Peter, in tears, responds, Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you. Feed my sheep. Follow me. You see, Jesus restores Peter to his place of discipleship. Jesus now speaks to you this Sunday morning in 2013. How many times we have denied Jesus? How many times have we felt that we have failed in the calling that was put upon our life, and we think that God would be right and just in withdrawing the invitation and the call from us, and yet Jesus persists. The invitation is always there. The call is upon your life. It is an irrevocable call. You are called to be his disciple. You are called to follow him. And if you follow and give everything to him, you will be utterly and completely transformed, just as Peter was transformed. My brothers and sisters, Jesus deals with us in these deeply personal ways. He is the living Savior. He is the resurrected Christ. And as we encounter him, it's revealed to us who he is and all his magnificent love. And at the same time, we recall and we see ourselves as we really are, as broken human beings. But nonetheless, the divine love of God is relentless. It never gives up. It never fails. It's always present for us. And we are called to live in this higher kind of life. And that is the message of Peter, because Peter is every man. He's in the story so that you and I can see that you are Peter. I am Peter. We are all this disciple who seeks to follow the Lord, and yet we fall and we fail. And yet Jesus constantly restores us, not because we're so faithful, but because God is faithful. And he will never, ever betray or abandon us. And the time will come, no matter how old you are, when that call will be fulfilled in your life. God is determined to have you, and to have you be one of the disciples of his Son Jesus, who is the resurrected Lord of history. Let us now stand, and let us profess our faith in the living Christ, who has conquered death.